Good afternoon. My name is Stuart Ragaluth. I'm with Revolve Media. This is a pleasure for me to be here today in front of you. We're now strategic partners of the EU Sustainable Energy Week, so we've helped put together this forum towards the end of the week to act as the finale, if you will. Two words about Revolve Media. We have our quarterly magazine here that's all about energy. I encourage you to look and read the editorial by Claude Turmes that is about establishing a carbon floor price, which is, in his view, only possible if we get rid of the ETS. So it's a bit controversial, but it's for some it's a solution towards the future. And it was echoed by Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Prize economist, as many of you know, who wrote in The Guardian, if Trump wants to withdraw the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, the rest of the world should impose a carbon adjustment tax on US exports that do not comply with global standards. So this is a pretty big comment that we'll hear throughout come in and out of the debate today. We also have a photo essay that was in cooperation with IRENA, so it was great to be with the International Renewable Energy Agency. If you go over to the Commission, you'll see our exhibition that's all about the energy transition. And within that, we now are closing the loop in our little way in the sense that we're trying to implement the concept of repurposing, which is to reuse materials to make new products. So we're actually reusing the canvases from our exhibitions and we're making bags. We've started at a very pilot level, but there are some extra bags outside for anybody who may want those after the exhibition. This year we did it with our partner organization that we're a member of called Greenovate Europe. Greenovate Europe is an independent expert group dedicated to the development of sustainable business. And lastly, before I hand over the floor to our representative from the Commission, we offer our communication services to a panoply of EU projects related to sustainability. So anybody who wants to contact us, Patricia is here from Barcelona, Savina Cenuche and Vanessa and Vivian are over here. And on that, I'm going to pass the floor to Mr. Rémi Deneau, who is Policy Officer for the New Energy Technologies, Innovation, and Clean Coal from DG Energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I was invited to speak about transforming the EU energy transition for prosperous and cleaner economies and societies. I think this is the title of the entire session, if I'm not mistaken. So why is this energy transition? Why are we doing all this? So you just mentioned this COP21 conference and this, let's say, global action plan, which was agreed with some countries, and one of them just withdrew. And this action plan is about to put the world on track to avoid dangerous climate change by limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees. And in fact, I would say the EU energy policy or the EU climate and energy policy is fully behind this. And maybe you're aware about this, but when I will speak in a moment about the climate energy package. In fact, this goal or these numbers that we put in the package, they are aligned behind this, so they are in line to achieve this. So it's not that we have 2 degrees here, minus 20% there, and so on and so on. So that there is some modeling behind this, and these are not just, of course, these are policy objectives, but there is some engineering, some calculation, and some knowledge behind this. Another motivation for us to engage in the energy transition is that you probably know that the EU imports more than 50% of its energy. This costs us 400 billion euros per year. That's a billion euro per day that we send outside of the EU to buy mostly hydrocarbon fuels, and mostly from countries with which we do not always share, let's say, the political values or the societal value. So this is, of course, another big motivation. Just to tell you, the yearly budget of the European Union in 2016 was 150 million euro. And I just mentioned that we pay 150 billion euros, sorry, and we send out every year 400 billion euros. So you may not like to see as much as 400 billion euro of European Union, but this gives you a bit what you're talking about. Another sign, and this is very tangible for those of you who live in large cities where the air quality is monitored because of particles, because of NOx, and this is, I mean, without talking about global warming and things like this, so this is something also very tangible for which we should engage into clean energy, into clean transport, into EU energy transition. Just to support a few things I'm going to say later on, at the beginning of 1900 on this planet, we were 1.6 billion inhabitants. I'm throwing a lot of numbers like this. I'm an engineer, so that's why I like numbers. Today we are 7.5 billion inhabitants. So the population between 1900 and now has been multiplied by 4. The prediction for 2050 is close to 10 billion. And for the EU, so currently the EU, we are 500 million, and most likely this will not change much until 2050. So we are really in a perspective where the population will grow a lot outside of the EU, and there will be some competition for the resources, be it energy, but be it material, be it water, all these kind of things. So I think that there's no real alternative to this energy transition, to engage in it and to be active. So as I said, the 2020 and 2030 climate energy package that you all know, they are to support this. For 2020, the first aim, minus 20% greenhouse gas emission with respect to 1990. So that's 30 years to make minus 20%. The next goal for 2030 is minus 40%, still with respect to 1990. So the next goal is in 10 years to do what we've been doing in the last 30 years. And if you look at the 2050 numbers, we're talking about 80% plus. So today, for the 20% by 2020, so the 20% greenhouse gas reduction by 2020, we are on track. Now, will we be able to meet the objective for 2030 and 2050? This is another story, and this really means that we have to dedicate strong efforts to that. One encouraging thing in the legislation that we have, for example, so you probably know that 50% of our energy bill goes to heating and cooling. We have one directive that is called the Energy Efficiency Directive for Building, which says after 2020, all new buildings should be nearly zero energy. So it will take time, but sooner or later, we should need no gas or no oil for heating purpose. And that's a good news, and that's one contribution to these 2030 objectives. So the second objective of the climate energy package is about energy efficiency. So the best energy is the one that we do not use. So it's about precisely having buildings that are better insulating. This means to have industrial processes that are more efficient, more energy efficient. Here again, for 2020, we had a goal of 20% improvement in energy efficiency with some baseline, 27% for 2030. We are slightly below tracks for 2020, but let's say we are not too far away. So what has happened is that, of course, our energy technologies have been improving, doing some energy savings. And we have seen that in absolute term, the energy consumption in the EU has been reducing over the last year. So some of you may say, yes, this is maybe at the expense of some heavy energy or energy-intensive industry, which went out of the EU, but not only. And still in this same period where we have reduced our absolute consumption of energy, the GDP has continued to grow. So this decoupling between GDP and the overall energy consumption is happening today. And so that's also a good sign. This energy transition, I mentioned the 50% imports. So for us, more renewable. The third goal of our climate energy package is 20% renewable for 2020, and we should be there, 27% for 2030. So this growth of renewable is very important because this will reduce our dependence to the outside. So for the time being, I must say, renewable have been phasing out, I would say, probably coal. Gas is still growing, but this is a real contributor to our energy independency, if you want, and this should, on the long term, reduce these 400 billion that we are sending outside every year. So it's not about climate, quality of air, and so on. It's also about economy, and it's also about our energy security, our independence. If we speak about jobs, so currently the energy sectors in the EU employs 3.3 million person, big sector, big employer. Today, only 20% of these jobs are linked to the renewable, let's say, industry, renewable energy production, and so on. Which means that 80% is still with quote old energy technology. So what we expect, again, in a scenario towards 2050, so in line with the goal that I mentioned, is that, so I said that we are decreasing our overall energy consumption. Our population is more or less stable. And the projections says that in a scenario where we are active, let's say, to reduce our greenhouse gas emission, these 3.3 million jobs will grow maybe to 3.7 million. So not that much. But what will happen is, so what the projection says is that in 2050, half of the jobs, so today 20%, in 2050, half of the job will be in the renewable energy sector. And this is, of course, a very big change. And I would say we are not too badly placed for this. So today we are one of the first manufacturers for wind turbines. We are producing around 30% of electric cars worldwide. Where we probably miss a step, and you all know this, is with PV. So the challenge now for, let's say, to get to this 3.7 billion jobs and to get to these 50% jobs in the renewable energy sector is to keep this position that we have today, to keep this in the years to come, and then so of course there's an element of risk. There's a competition with other regions, but there's also an element of opportunities because, as I said, the worldwide population will grow mostly outside of Europe, and we have these green technologies. We know how to manage the largest electricity network on Earth with very high share of renewables, a good deal of them being variable renewables, wind and solar. So all this expertise, all these manufacturing technologies, all this knowledge about handling energy system, this is something which is an asset, let's say, for us. And this is an asset, let's say, for that we can promote, let's say, in the international context and in the international energy community. So this is basically what I wanted to say, that this energy transition is needed, and I hope I succeeded to, well, you're probably all convinced that this is the case anyway. So not only from climate and environment perspective, so to have a livable planet for our kids, but also for our energy security, for our economy, for exports. And that's why the Commission, so not only with these 20%, 30%, and all these percentage I mentioned, but you have probably seen this clean energy package. So we are engaging with a clean energy package in what I just said, but with regulation, so regulations and directives for the electricity sectors, the renewable energy directives, the energy efficiency directive, the energy efficiency directive in buildings. So all these numbers I mentioned, you find them in one or the other directives. And ultimately, the goal is really that, well, this package is adopted as much as possible, and that will really be a driver for this energy transition to take place in the EU. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Remy, for that great positive overview of how Europe is positioning itself as an energy transition leader. I'm going to pass the floor now to Luc Sussums, who is a senior researcher at Carbon Tracker, and I believe you have some slides and a great presentation.
Hi, everyone. Just in case any of you don't know who Carbon Tracker are, we are a financial think tank based out of London, who coined the terms unburnable carbon and stranded assets to try and generate awareness around climate risk. And I've been asked to provide some context to the excellent panel discussion that you've got coming up, which is a pretty difficult task considering you've probably been sitting through 2 days of conferences and talks. But I think I'm going to try and go against the grain a little bit here, because I don't know if, like me, you've been to a lot of energy conferences recently, and they all say that the low-carbon transition is inevitable, it's definitely going to happen, it's just a matter of time. Now, not only has that become slightly repetitive and a bit boring, but also I think probably it's a little bit misleading too. So I intend to actually outline some of the challenges that need to be overcome if we are going to enact the low-carbon transition at a rate required to keep climate change to secure levels. And so I've identified 3 trends that must be reversed and that highlight that the energy transition isn't quite guaranteed yet. The first is that government pledges, the NDCs, fall short of 2 degrees C, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Also, that energy companies are actually looking to extend the status quo, essentially maintain the energy mix as it is. And, as Carbon Tracker has done a lot of research on in the past, fossil fuel reserves and resources will have to stay in the ground. And there will be a lot of parties that will fight tooth and nail to ensure that that doesn't happen and that they don't lose value based on that. And I will end on some upsides because I feel bad otherwise to do a presentation that's just incredibly negative. I'm sure this chart has probably been used quite a lot also over the last 2 days. It's actually from Climate Action Tracker, no relation to us, although we do get quite a lot of attention from them. And essentially it shows that business as usual trajectories, the blue lines, and even the NDC pledges, which are the red lines, aren't consistent with a 2 degrees C or even a 1.5 degree trajectory. In fact, they diverge quite significantly, and that by 2030, the NDC pledges are about 15 to 18 gigatons of CO2 higher than a 2 degrees trajectory. Obviously, beyond 2030, that divergence continues. And I probably won't talk about the level of divergence to the 1.5 degrees trajectory. And what I really want to emphasize about this, though, which I often think is forgotten, is that the NDCs are by no means guaranteed. A lot of work needs to be put in to actually deliver those NDCs. And as you can see, those NDCs, even in their current form, probably don't go quite far enough. And I think one of the best examples, or at least one of the most relevant examples at the moment, is of course happening in the US and Donald Trump. And I think there's a bit of myth going around about this as well. The general rhetoric, which I hear again at every event, is that Trump can't do anything to halt the low-carbon transition. It's going on without him. And that's purely based on the economics of renewables against fossil fuel alternatives, conventional fossil fuels. Now, the chart, which is a little bit small, is some analysis by us that shows on an LCOE basis, on average across the US, solar and wind is actually cheaper than gas and coal. If you actually use the correct load factors, we found that actually people are using load factors for gas and coal that are way higher than are actually being delivered in the US, which completely changes the LCOE cost competitiveness of the fuels. So this is why people say that Trump can't do anything. You know, of course, cheaper fuels are going to be selected in the power grid. But actually, that's not entirely true. That's true in liberalized power markets, i.e. where it's in the interest of the utility to supply power on the least cost basis. But actually, a lot of the US and actually a lot of global power markets are actually regulated, which means that the rate of return is guaranteed to the utility, which means that they have very little incentive whatsoever to actually go to the cheapest option because the amount that they can sell their power for is guaranteed. So actually, that doesn't bode too well when we think about trying to move away from the 700 or so coal plants that are in the US, that are currently operating in the US. And then talking again to Trump, but I'm sure everyone knows this, you know, Trump is sort of gutting the US EPA and the climate change spending that they have and the Clean Power Plan and things like that. One of the upsides, I guess, is that the US NDC wasn't actually that ambitious in the first place, so maybe in terms of your emissions trajectory, we haven't actually gone too much higher given Trump's pledge to pull out of the Paris Agreement. But there's still a lot of work to be done here. Going to, you know, carbon trackers bread and butter, which some of you, as I say, may know, some fossil fuel reserves and resources need to stay in the ground. Essentially what this chart is showing is that total fossil fuel reserves globally have CO2 embedded in them close to around 3,000 gigatons of CO2, and that's an estimate from the IEA. And our remaining carbon budget to keep to within 2 degrees C at the moment is probably down to about 800 gigatons. So what we're saying is that about 3/4 of fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground. What we're also saying is that beyond reserves there are things called resources, which are less definite. I mean, companies aren't quite as sure that they're going to be able to extract it from the ground and sell it at a profit. So they need to invest a bit more money in it. And the IPCC estimated that global fossil fuel resources are between 30,000 and 50,000 gigatons of CO2. So really, so much of this has to stay in the ground, and really, and this unburnable carbon thesis is just a fact. But there are going to be a lot of parties that try to fight against it. And some of those parties are energy companies. Now, energy companies foresee that fossil fuel demand will go up in the future. What this chart shows, there are 3 columns which you may or may not be able to see, that are the energy outlooks for ExxonMobil, BP, and Statoil. Now what it shows is that the segment at the top of each bar, which is the amount of renewables, actually gains market share on current rates. So renewables currently supply, or non-fossil fuels, sorry, currently supply about 19% of global energy. Each one of these energy companies foresees this going up to above 20%. This allows companies to be able to say, look, we're aligned with the low-carbon transition, we're encouraging the low-carbon transition. What, however, they often forget to mention is that actually energy demand as a whole goes up quite considerably over this time frame, which is the size of the bar, which is the height of the bar. When you factor that in, actually demand for fossil fuels in their outlooks goes up quite considerably. Essentially what they're saying is, we have a smaller piece of the pie, but the pie itself is much, much larger now. And as the bar on the right shows, these outlooks are very much inconsistent with a 2-degree scenario. In this instance, it's the IEA 450 scenario, where renewables or other non-fossil fuels account for 42% of the energy mix. So if energy companies think that fossil fuel demand is going to go up quite considerably in the future, then they are also able to justify to investors significant investment going forward in new supply. You need to meet that demand. So we actually released a report just yesterday with UNPRI and a number of 7 other institutional investors, which looked at the incompatibility of potential spending from 69 oil and gas companies with a 2-degree scenario. So their potential spending over just the next 10 years is the black line, which is rising quite considerably in this chart. The actual level of capital expenditure in a 2-degree scenario to meet demand in a 2-degree scenario is shown by the shaded blue region. The difference equates to $2.3 trillion of potential spending over just the next 10 years by these companies. If you add coal into the mix, that's another 200 billion that's being spent on projects that don't fit within a 2-degree scenario. They don't fit because they're too high cost. They don't make a profit in this scenario because the price of whichever commodity we're talking about, coal, oil, and gas, is too low for them to actually break even. This is quite a significant amount of money that we think investors should be going to companies and saying, is this really a good way to spend our money? Of the oil majors, ExxonMobil was the most exposed to this potential wasted capex, where 40 to 50% of their potential spending over just the next 10 years doesn't fit within a 2-degree scenario. I said I'd end on some upsides, and so I will, although I'm sure this has been said very, very often over the last 2 days. Solar PV has come down considerably. That's generally shown by the downward trajectory of the points on this graph. Also, because this graph is out to 2050, the costs of solar PV are expected to continue falling. Now, if solar PV costs follow the real low-end parts of this chart, which is the capital costs of solar PV, so around the red and yellow dots, which we actually modeled with Imperial College, then solar PV could make up more than a quarter of the global power mix by 2050. In the same study that we did with Imperial College, we did a similar run for the potential penetration of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are showing incredible potential both to reduce costs today and also in the future. And if EVs reach cost parity with oil-burning combustion engine vehicles by 2020, we see that quite a significant amount of oil demand could be displaced, potentially 2 million barrels by 2025. Now, that might not mean a lot to most people, but to put that in context, 2 million barrels a day is the same swing in the supply-demand balance in the oil markets that caused the oil price crash in 2014, 2050. So we debate with the companies when they say that EVs aren't a potential disruptor to their business model. And finally, looking towards the more medium term, this chart looks at energy storage. Like those other technologies that I've mentioned, the costs are falling faster than most people expect. And sometimes it's quite fun to look at what forecasts people made a few years ago and what actually happened. So each one of these lines looks at the projected cost of energy storage made by institutions in 2014. The point itself, the little mark in the bottom left, is what cost actually materialized the following year in 2015. So it was $265 per kilowatt hour, and we thank BNEF for that number. And that cost point is approximately 12 years ahead of what the industry average thought would happen, and and for more conservative institutions like the US EIA, they didn't even, which is the orange line, they didn't even think that that cost point would be hit before 2050. So we like to look towards some of the upsides and some of the potential disruptions that could occur from these low-carbon technologies that are progressing at a pace far faster than the energy industry is actually expecting. I hope that provided some context to the panel discussion, and that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Luke. I think that was a great introduction to the first panel now that's going to be moderated and presented by Bryony Bennett, who's policy analyst for Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Should your colleagues join you on stage right away? Go on up, guys. Don't be shy.
So as Stuart just said, I'm Bryony Bennett. I'm a policy analyst for Bloomberg New Energy Finance based in London. Last week, we published our 2017 New Energy Outlook, and we predicted there that coal-fired power generation will peak globally in 2026. Renewables are already starting to outcompete new fossil fuel capacity without subsidies. And so our model is merely based on economics. Adding to what Luke just said, the amount of planned coal already, the amount of coal which is already planned, we predict that more than 35% of it just won't even get built. Nevertheless, in Europe, a continent, a region which is decarbonising much faster than other regions, even in 2040, fossil fuels still have a role to play in the power sector, meeting peak demand or periods of low renewables output. And this is before we even look at the heating, the transport, or God forbid, the agricultural sector's greenhouse gas emissions. So we would argue the transition is not going fast enough if we seek to meet our Paris commitments. But with me today, I have 4 panelists who offer 4 different perspectives on my view. Perhaps they'll agree, perhaps they'll think even more stronger thoughts. We have Gonzalo Sanz de Miera, who's Climate Change Director at Iberdrola. We have Jorgo Chatzimarkakis, who's Secretary General at Hydrogen Europe. And we have Michael Kirst, who represents Westinghouse as VIP of Strategy for EMEA. And we have Manon Dufour, who works for E3G, which is a carbon energy non-profit, where she's head of EU affairs. So Gonzalo, I'll let you start your presentation. Everyone will speak for a few minutes, and then I'll ask some questions at the end.
Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to participate in this conference. So can we move away from fossil fuels? My answer is yes, okay? And I'm gonna show you an exercise we did in Spain, analyzing how generation and consumption in all energy sectors, in all economic sectors, have to evolve in order to meet the objective, the targets in Europe for 2030 and 2050. So we are saying what we have to do in order to reduce 80% of our CO2 emissions. And we conclude, in line what Luc was saying, that thanks to the clean technological revolution that was amazing in the last years of renewables, energy batteries, and electric vehicles, and the reduction of cost, these European targets for 2030 and 2050 that only 3 or 4 years ago seemed very costly and very difficult are now viable from an economic and technical point of view. And more than that those scenarios are not only viable, but are good for the European economy because of the co-benefits they have in terms of energy dependency, reduction of energy dependency, development of the industry, of European industry, because we are very well placed with renewables, with the automotive industry, and so on. And a very important element that is air quality, that we think, we are convinced, is going to be a very, very important driver for the energy transition. So in order to move to this sustainable scenario that we think is possible, we have to do 2 things: energy efficiency and renewables. And because the only way to introduce renewables into the energy sector is electricity, this scenario will tend to a greater electrification of the economy. So this is the general results for Spain. So this is the energy consumption today in 2013. This is the last data of CO2 emissions officials in Spain. And as you see here, oil represents 40% of the energy consumption, coal something like 2%, gas, natural gas 19%, electricity 27%, and renewable energy for final energy use is just 7%. So if we want to meet the objectives of 2050, oil will have to disappear. So you see, oil will come from 45 to minus to something like 1%. Coal will disappear. We will see a process of electrification in most of the sectors, and I will show later. And finally, natural gas will have a place to roll as a transition, energy transition in transport, in building, and also in industry. So this is the analysis for the different sectors. So we'll start with transport. Transport today, this is the case of Spain, is mainly based in oil. But we think because of batteries, and I agree with Luc, we think that electric vehicles are going to be fully competitive in 2021. You said 2020? We think in 2021. So people will move to electric bicycles because an economic decision and not taking into account other regulations that in cities, I think it would be forbidden. So we will see a process of electrification, 65%, within that 65% of the light vehicles in Europe or in Spain will be new cars will be electric cars, and 100% of the new vehicles will be electric in 2050. We also see electrification of the road transportation, rail transportation and trucks, and we see a small 20% of gas for trucks, okay? In the case of buildings, there are two drivers, energy efficiency and also electrification because of heat pumps. And this is the case of Spain. Now we have 5 million heat pumps, and we think that we will need 15 million in 2030. And finally, in the industry, this is much more heterogeneous. We see an increase in final consumption. We are considering here an increase of the GDP of 1.3% per year. And we see a process of electrification, but some process, they need very high temperatures, so they will maintain natural gas. So, what happened with the electricity sector? Today, this is demand will increase because there will be a process of electrification in all the sectors. And today, this is how is it covered? By renewables, by nuclear, this is the case of Spain, CCGTs, and coal. In 2030, we will have much more renewables, we will have nuclear, we will see in Spain, and we will have CCGTs, gas, okay? But we won't have any coal at all. And in 2050, we will have almost 100% renewables because photovoltaic and wind will be fully competitive. And of course, there are intermittent technologies, but we will have backup generation and we will have demand response, we will have interconnections, we will have storage. We will have storage like pump storage, hydro pump storage in Spain. We will have other storage batteries in 2050. But we have here considered the worst case scenario, that is turbines, gas turbines. But they will work just, I don't know, something like 50 hours per year. So we'll have an almost 100% renewable. So my takeaways from this sustainable scenario, my conclusions. EU policies targeted for 2030 and 2050 and the Paris Agreement commitments are viable from a technical and economic point of view. Those targets are not only viable, but are desirable in terms of growth. If we really develop these industries in Europe, okay, this is very important, industrial development, reduction of energy dependency, and air quality. Air quality in cities as a main driver. And are a unique opportunity of Europe because of Europe we have the energy dependency and we have all these industries. The main drivers towards the decarbonized economy are energy efficiency improvement and electrification of end uses through renewable development. This is key. If you don't have renewables, for instance, you don't reduce the energy consumption in the transport sector because renewables is 100% efficient. Those developments are viable, but current regulation present important barriers, and maybe in the debate we can go, for instance, the tax barriers and a lack of tax environmental reform in Europe is a very, very important drivers. But a very important obstacle. There is a wide range of short-term measures that can be implemented now, and those that are not implemented now should be announced now in order to change the investment and habits. And this analysis is focused in the Spanish case, but I think in the main conclusions are of interest for other European countries. Thank you very much.
Normally we were going to go to Jorgo next. You have slides for Jorgo coming up third? No? No slides?
I can speak without slides.
Excellent.
Sometimes better. So thank you very much. I totally agree. I have to explain how to manage the renewables. And before starting that, I have to tell you that hydrogen has three capacities, three heads. It's a fascinating animal. It's a chemical substance. You need it in industrial processes. It's the second energy carrier. We mostly talk about electricity as an energy carrier using electrons via wires, but there's a second energy carrier, and hydrogen uses molecules to carry the energy. So it's the gaseous form of electricity. And thirdly, it's a fuel. You can fuel it into a car with a fuel cell, you burn it. You don't burn it, it's a chemical process, but it's like burning it and like producing electrical power on board. So all you said about electric mobility is battery electric and hydrogen electric. So having started that, I have to say one thing. There's a new word that has been used now recently in Brussels, in the Brussels energy bubble. It's a German word. It's called Winterflaute. Winterflaute means that you have renewable energy production all over the year, especially in the summertime, excess production, and in the winter time, you have Flaute, no production, deficit. There's a huge deficit. At least 3 weeks of a year, we cannot, by any means, meet what we need in energy consumption with renewables. What we need is seasonal storage. You talked about storage. You forgot one storage capacity, that's hydrogen. So hydrogen is a storage capacity that you use for big volumes for long times. You can use caverns for that. You could use the gas grid as a sink for that. And that is why my main message here for you is very simple. And it has been forgotten as a word in the clean energy package. It's called sectoral integration. What we need is to extend, so to say, the capacity of the power grid by the gas grid, by using the capacity of the gas grid for the second energy carrier, which is hydrogen. Why? Because we now are only fixed on the power grid. Also your predictions, power grid. We would need to cover the Winterflaute, the deficit in winter, 5 times as much capacity. Talked about interconnections. Nice word. Do you know how long it takes to build the interconnectors? 13 years. Do you know that there are a lot of countries that have interconnectors, don't use them, Germany, Denmark, out of political reasons. So why not use the other grid, which is there? And hydrogen is the best way to do it. Why is it important? In the year 2015, let's take a country which was quite successful in the last years in ramping up renewable energy. We had an excess production that was curtailed by 4.7 terawatt hours in Germany only. 4.7 terawatt hours. Claude Thomas later on will say, well, it was reduced in 2016, yes. But if we want to meet all these targets, we have to ramp up renewables so that there will be an excess production that's much over that. So do it with batteries? Maybe not. Even if the price goes down, there's the physical thing where to put all these batteries. For seasonal storage, not possible. Hydro pump, excellent. Works in Austria, doesn't work in the Netherlands, no mountains. So you see, every technology will find the right place, and that is why this hydrogen technology plays a role. Now let me move to mobility. We are excellent, not excellent. We are quite good. We saw the figures also. Remy showed us or told us some figures. When it comes to power, we are quite good in renewables in power, in the power sector. We are not that good in heating and cooling, and we are extremely poor in mobility, extremely poor. Why is it so? Because people just don't buy these cars, just don't believe it. Let me add to your complication another technology. We use hydrogen electric cars that need 5 minutes to fuel them and go 500 kilometers. So no change of life habits, but no fueling stations. There's one in Belgium. There are 40 in Germany, 12 in Denmark. Denmark is covered. Denmark is super. There's half in France. It's nothing. So we are at the beginning of something, and you are right to tell me, how can I use a hydrogen electric car if there's no fueling station? Right, so look at the Commission. Commission did very well, DG Anna, in the energy package. When we look at the mobility package, wow, nothing, just battery. No, nothing. I checked it. I checked the leaked version before. There was hydrogen in 3 times. Final step, published version, hydrogen out. Well, the Commission says we took off 5 years, so it's not until 2030, it's only 2025 and hydrogen will not be ready. Wrong. Very wrong. We will prove that wrong, because if everybody who has a Tesla car, I love Tesla, I love battery cars, and you will love them having driven them. But you will also see that there's no difference between hydrogen electric, battery electric if you drive them, just another range. But if you have a Tesla, and you have 3 Teslas here in Ixelles, Etterbeek, in parts of Brussels, and they all come together, breakdown. So this is something we don't have in our calculations. And we need to ease, so to say, the grid capacity, and you can do that by using hydrogen. Less capacity or less efficiency? Yes, 70%. It's much more than diesel with 30%. It's much more than curtailing. It's 0%. So we have to think about it. And my last point is there is no silver bullet. There's no one single technology which meets all criteria. I can see Thomas Novak here from the European Heat Pump Association. He did a wonderful job all over these years. Heat pumps are in, at least in the texts, right? And when we met, we understood why are people thinking that hydrogen fuel cells and heat pumps are enemies. They are not. They have another niche, we have another niche. In the end, it will be putting all these abilities of technologies together. And that is why I say not to you, but to DG Move people might be here. You did a big mistake by focusing only on one technology. We did that already with biofuels before. We failed. We shouldn't do that, like lemmings running into one technology. It's wrong. So that is why sector integration, bringing all the sectors together with enablers like electricity and hydrogen is important. Thank you very much.
We'll hear from Michael Kurz from Westinghouse next. I believe you have some slides.
I do. If I could have the, yeah. Thank you.
There we go.
I'll try to go through them quickly.
Take your time.
What a wonderful segue you just gave me. Thank you very much for that. Because I'm representing de facto the nuclear industry in this discussion today, and we're often not part of the discussion in this. And indeed, as part of the winter package that our colleague from the hydrogen industry mentioned, their name was in the draft, then didn't make it in the final. And that was because they felt that you weren't going to be ready. Well, we're already here, and we were not in the draft or in the final. So we've got even bigger problems. And indeed, if we go to the first slide, just to remind people, and then I'll get to some of the discussion that we want to have. Nuclear is currently providing roughly 27% of the total energy supply in the EU. That's a fact. We're also the largest contributor to the avoidance of carbon in the EU. So those two things right there need to be part of an equation when we talk about not one single technology should be dictated as we move forward. And in fact, our Spanish colleague from Iberdrola was also happy to see that in his slide, he mentioned through the transition to 100% renewables, nuclear would be there until roughly 2050. So that is a very rational, very good, not necessarily a good approach, but it's a rational approach. And the point is that people want to believe that we can do this without nuclear, and we are trying that to some degree in Germany. Because the Germans, there's another German word that's often used in the Brussels energy bubble called Energiewende. And Energiewende now has been in effect for roughly 5 years. And what we've seen in Germany, the net effect of that is roughly higher CO2, at least last year and the year before, and higher costs. People I see are shaking their heads. I can show you the data. But the point is, there is a very strong, difficult move from where we are today to a non-nuclear renewables only view. The second part that I wanted to stress is the security of supply. If the panel is about to talk about moving away from fossil, then are we going to move away from fossil through intermittent generation? Because intermittent generation in itself requires backup power, at least as of today, until you can help us, and indeed the battery capacities come online. And so that is the reality today too. And where is a lot of that gas coming from? Well, from places that not necessarily are where we want to go. And in fact, the Commission official said this was part of the energy package, was to create more independence, create security of supply. This is not actually adding to that if you need to increase. And in fact, back to the Energiewende, Germany increased their gas supply by 10% last year. So that is a substantial increase into a less secure environment from that standpoint. Now, it's going to be about politics, but it's also going to be about economics. And on economics, you look at fossil fuel generation, and we'll use a combined cycle plant, and I think this might be helpful for people. The total lifetime cost of a combined cycle gas plant is about 20% is the cost of the build, and 80% is the cost of the actual fuel. On a nuclear plant, it's exactly the opposite. 80% of the total lifetime cost is the construction, a lot of money, as we all read about, but only 20% is the fuel. So if the fuel costs, for instance, double, for the worst case scenario for nuclear, the total price to the consumer, or I should say the cost coming out of the actual generator, is about a 6% increase. Whereas if it doubled on a gas plant, you're talking 60 or 70%. So right now, we're enjoying relatively low gas prices. Can we be assured of that in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years? I think that's a big question. And that's something we're embedding into the European system right now. So there's a risk here, definite risk. Let me move to also this chart. I think the future, and I think most in the nuclear industry believe, that renewables will be the predominant source of generation, and we fully support that. What we're suggesting is that it needs help. So as our hydrogen friend also wants to say is, we're here too. And it could be a transitory phase, or it could be somewhat of a more permanent phase. But the bottom line is, if you look at these numbers, you'll see that the aforementioned fuel cost differences, but also the efficiency factors. Now, these are going to be variable because in some places, like in Spain or Italy or some places like that where the solar capacity is at a higher level, they'll be higher than these capacity figures. I grant that. But when we talk about an EU-wide perspective, we have to look at it from that. And this is where we're looking to bridge that gap. This gets me to, and I'm going to skip a couple of slides for time. Nuclear. Everybody talks about nuclear as of course, a dinosaur, baseload technology, and we don't need baseload. I would argue we do still need baseload, unfortunately, because today we have still a very modern and growing economy that requires 24/7 energy. And because of the intermittency of renewables, it needs to be offset. And that means by a gas-fired plant that gets capacity market payments, which certainly isn't something that we should be supporting because neither is it economic nor is it environmentally friendly. But it also allows or disallows the ability for nuclear to perform a task that nobody really realized. And if you see by this chart, and it's again kind of illustratory, you can see that nuclear plants can actually move up and down consistent with the grid requirements. This is something that people don't really realize. And indeed, we move, in fact, just as fast as a combined cycle plant if needed. Now, people will say, well, I don't know, that's not really proven or what have you. The last slide is just a simple visual. This is the German grid on nuclear supply in a year. And you can see all that volatility up and down, up and down. And so the Energiewende was designed, of course, to take nuclear off the grid, bring in renewables, and back it up with gas. But because of the current state of affairs, they're needing to actually use those nuclear plants moderating up and down. Therefore, they're contributing to their energy security, but also reducing their CO2 footprint. If those were not happening, then the figures would be much worse in Germany. So hence, what we're suggesting is, we hope the proposals and the debate in Europe will recognize the very strong contributions of nuclear right now and today, and indeed in the future, if we move to electrification with electrical vehicles, those electrical vehicles will be needing a lot of backup power. And that means 24/7 in sometimes very difficult conditions. That again would be something that nuclear would be able to support. So anyway, I hope that that was helpful to you, and look forward to the discussion.
Should I go? Or?
Go for it.
Oh, okay, I thought you were. So hi, I'm Manon Dufour. So I head the Brussels office of environmental think tank E3G. So I knew we were going to talk about technologies and fuels, so I thought maybe I would speak about the rest, the type of kind of systems or policies we would need. And because that has the potential of being fairly daunting, I thought I would start with kind of a positive note. I was thinking of the name of the panel, like moving away from fossil fuels, and I was reflecting that I think a few years ago, or 10 years ago, a few years ago, I think that the title would actually have had like a question mark at the end, and the question would have been like, should we move away from fossil fuels? And since then, I mean, whatever your face of predilection is, whether it's God or whether it's markets or it's like global diplomacy, you should be pretty convinced by now that we should. I mean, there's some kind of very notable exceptions in a kind of white building in DC right now, but let's not talk about this. Even just a bit later, like a few years ago, we still would have had like an entire debate about whether we can. And I think since then, I mean, we can still talk about it, of course, but whether it's the IEA or you have like more and more like reports backed by like Shell or BHP Billiton that are not the greenest companies that are saying actually it's technically and economically feasible to move to 2 degrees, and the IEA very recently even started looking at kind of a scenario of well below 2 degrees, which is a bit newer, at least in kind of global terms, and also finds that it's not easy for sure, but it's technologically and economically feasible. So we still have like a monumental task ahead of us, but for me this is progress that we get to finally talk about the how, and I'm really happy that kind of the other panelists are kind of offering their services for the how, like which are going to be the best technologies. So anyway, so how? I won't tell you actually how, but like just the first point is that so the EU went through already kind of couple of stages of decarbonization. If we start kind of thinking of how it, like what it takes to decarbonize, the first stage we would call is basically getting it started. So you have like just a few policies, a few targets, ETS, a few like renewable targets here and there to just get the market started. It's kind of, it's small, it's cute. Then you get to phase 2, where the kind of investment in low carbon kind of resources starts really flowing. And then you have to basically focus on setting like roadmaps, budgets, policies to stay on course. And we've done that. Really what we're at now, at least as a bloc in the EU, I mean, not all countries obviously are at the same stage, is at the beginning of stage 3. Stage 3 is when all of this starts being very disruptive. We've seen in the EU already that through like energy efficiency policies, through kind of renewable energy renewable energy kind of raising over 20% in some markets in the electricity sector, start depressing prices with a bit of the help of the financial crisis. And it really starts eating in the revenues of incumbent companies. And this is what really disruptions looks like. And then that's when you start thinking about more fundamental reform of going from a kind of very marginal sector to something much broader. So we're in stage 3. So what do we do? So, I mean, first of all, that's what, the slides aren't going to be very super informative, but I'll talk through it. I mean, the first thing is to, because that's how we deal with the transition, we start with the power sector, and is to start making the power market fit for really high shares of renewable energy, however, what other resources you have on it. So it means in Europe, like a strong continental energy market. Like we've heard from the Commission before that it's the widest in the world. This is true. We've also heard that it's not yet the most efficient. Some interconnections are not being used, so it's doubled down on it. So more interconnections and better use of them. But really, I think for me, the most disruptive elements that we're trying to push through the clean energy package is to really give a key role to demand reduction through energy efficiency, energy savings, and demand-side flexibility. So our conventional wisdom is that energy markets or energy systems move very slowly. Yet, as we heard, like technology costs have fallen at kind of record speed, whether we're talking about solar, onshore wind, well, actually wind in general, so onshore and offshore batteries. But we're also seeing European gas demand falling 20% in just 5 years. It's actually quite fast. And we can also find out that even though we are a bit scared of like now tackling the consumers and wondering how much prosumers could actually engage in electricity markets, if we're seeing at how adoption rates for technologies have moved across the past century, it's very fast right now. I mean, whether you're thinking like smartphones or tablets, it just takes a few years. So we haven't yet harnessed this in energy, but like it's not inconceivable that the same could happen. So for me, the role of policymakers within this, and that's, again, I think the Clean Energy Package tries to do some of it and could be, like the negotiators in the Council and Parliament now could kind of make it even better, is to, on the one hand, really harness this potential of, harness the potential of the consumers and demand reductions through energy savings and demand-side flexibility. But on the other, just manage the transition by making sure that not too much public value goes into assets that are at risk of becoming stranded, given how fast everything can move. I would add that it's that's really the market approach, but more and more, and I think it speaks a bit to what Luke was talking about, the kind of just the unburnable fuel, is that more and more we will have to have more targeted intervention, actually have decisions to exit from kind of existing assets, so starting with coal actually. So we will need to really replace, not only just build more clean stuff, we will need to actively remove to actually remove the dirty assets. Again, not the most informative slides, but like on the left, it's really to explain that when we talk about coal, for instance, we will need actually to decide on an exit strategy, just because it's there's such a complex layer of legacy subsidies, just bad infrastructure, kind of complex regulations, that just waiting for a carbon price, for instance, to make it work won't be enough. And like one of my colleagues keeps saying, and I think that I'll share it because it's very useful, is that if we keep talking about how feasible the transition is in economics and technical terms, it just means that it's all political, like all the obstacles will be political. And if we understood just a little bit as much about the politics of the energy transition as we knew about the technology or the economics of it, we would be in a much better place. I think we're really far from understanding the entanglement that our economies have with fossil fuel. We haven't really yet started really talking about what would happen when we phase out coal, what would happen to the jobs and the workers and the regions that are really reliant on these industries. And then we haven't really started talking about how like the entire economy can run without revenues from fossil fuel taxes. So I think this is the next thing that policymakers need to start doing, is really to think about the politics and try to kind of manage this transition. And that's why I had this thing saying, like, the Commission at least started thinking about it in wider terms than just energy and climate. We have like kind of focus on these two, but like we're really looking on. They're starting to look at how investment plays into it, how green finance plays into it, what it could mean in terms of social policy. And I think if anything, like this Commission has about like 2 years left, 2.5 years left until they have to kind of give way for the next one. I think for me, like really getting that conversation starts really working on that stage 3 of the decarbonization will be a kind of crucial factor of their success. And just to explain that in the context, or in the global context right now, where kind of EU, China, and others are leading, beyond the level of ambition and how many tons of carbon you reduce, I think this is also where real leadership is actually spearheading and finding out how you deal with stage 3 and finding out that there's a stage 4 after that. So, thank you.
So before I ask some of my own questions, I wanted to invite my panelists to react to anything they heard, just in case you have some.
I liked your point, Manon, how. It's not the question whether, it's the question how. And here I think we have to cooperate more. I mean, to start religious wars, and they start. So when I told you what I told in the end, so to be put out as a technology, I asked, why did it happen? Because this was decided somewhere upstairs. Religion. Because somebody believed this is it, and the rest, I don't believe in it. Believing? This is not about believing here. It's about having decided in Paris we go that way, and now it's trying to find the right way to put it right. Fortunately, thank God, it's just a communication. It's not a legislative text, so we can work on it. But I think we should now sit together and not start to fight.
And maybe I'd like to make a comment as well on the, actually not the panelists, but actually I wanted to say something with Luke's presentation where he said, we have the next 10 years to do what we just did in the last 30 years, to not eat up our carbon budget. And that's an extraordinary statement. I've seen that before, and I think that's something that we also need to think about as the policymakers put that together is if we become technology specific or we exclude things, we may end up not meeting that absolute vital target. So.
I have a comment. Michael, comment on the role of nuclear in the future. So there are two things. First is new facilities, new, and the existing ones. So the existing ones, of course, it makes sense to maintain them because if you replace it, to close down, you have to do that with renewables and with gas. So it would be more gas emissions and CO2 emissions and whatever. For the new plants, I'm a bit more skeptical. Why? Because you say you need to the important thing is to get guarantee of supply. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that. And now renewables are really competitive to give 90% of the generation, 95% of the generation in 2040, 2050. But then you need other technologies that give you guarantee of supply. And there are other. I mean, we have, as you say, you have storage, you have hydro pump storage, you have other storage that will be developed, you have interconnection, you have energy, demand control. And in this context, I am a bit more skeptical of the competitiveness of nuclear because you have photovoltaic and wind at a cost of 40 or 30 euros per megawatt hour. And this will be unbeatable, I think, even with curtailments. That may be an issue. Not an issue for us. It's not an issue for the next 10 years. But in 10 years, it will be an issue. But
it's a great point. I would like to maybe put it as a question for you.
Sure.
You said maybe by 2050 we might see nuclear off the grid. You'd be retired, so perhaps it wouldn't be your job anymore. It wouldn't matter. But would you be prepared to see alternative flexibility providers, perhaps demand response or batteries, crowd your industry out?
I don't think we're in competition, actually. And so let me answer your question and I'll also refer to his point. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult for any industry up here, if you're not a renewables industry, to counter an argument that says, well, by 2050, we'll be able to handle 85, 90%. So, of course, we don't need you. That hasn't happened yet. That's not proven. That's a goal. That's some assumptions. But as we've said already, assumptions have been made and broken, and sometimes in a positive way. But I think that it's very dangerous for us to just say, well, start shutting them down, or don't invest in them, or don't try to develop the technology or other technologies because we can handle it ourselves. I think that's very dangerous. So, and then on demand response, yes, I mean, that's something that, I mean, we're a supplier of energy. We're not the actual utility. So from our perspective, it's, you can have stability of price and stability of cost. And on the cost, that's another thing I need to point out. A lot of people are talking about renewables coming in at certain levels of cost. What is in that cost? Is the backup cost included in that cost? So when it's only running at an average of 30, 35% or something like that, the 65% of the generation that's lost effectively because the turbines aren't running, you're incurring a cost. And that's the gas plant primarily, that's costing that. Plus also in many countries, the capacity payments to pay for that gas plant to be there and sitting there, which makes even less sense. So is all that cost included into that wind turbine cost or that solar plant cost? It's not. Neither is the transmission and grid extension. So I'm just saying, if we look for apples to apples, it's a little bit different.
Can I react to this?
Please. I will add to the cost as well,
Okay.
but Manon
No,
first.
I mean, just, I think on the question of, to be like Morgan, like we're an NGO, we're not like against nuclear. I think on the question of cost, it's actually difficult to argue for new nuclear. Like I take your point of like balancing apples to apples, but I think it's the same thing for nuclear. I think sometimes we don't really think of the decommissioning costs that are related to it. One thing you can't argue, like we've seen very little kind of like the learning curve on nuclear has been kind of ridiculously flat compared to one for renewables. So that's hard to compete on this basis. And just on the point on capacity payments, having to kind of be counted as part of the nuclear thing, it's, I mean, in Europe right now, a lot of the capacity payments, or at least the ones that are planned, are main, I mean, for now, I'm not saying, we'll see, I still think that we could have a very efficient market and make it work, but for now, most of the markets we're developing are more of as a result of overcapacity than need for renewables, than too much renewables on the system. So just, I think these points are, I think, you can really argue about the points you just made.
I agree to apples, but I also agree that in the end, who is it to put cost on a certain technology? It's the policymakers. Huh? It's a political decision whether or not have feed-in tariffs, whether or not have, well, the true price of nuclear, whether or not...
Or renewables. Yeah.
Or renewables. Well, renewables, we know that the taxpayers at the moment pays for them. And we have the first cases where wind industry comes to us, hydrogen industry says, hey, can you help us? We need to put our wind power into the train. But Kettneri is not being built. Can we do it together? Yes, we can. Because the train runs on hydrogen, we can just translate it, and we have a business plan for a time without subsidies, without feed-in. But I want to say something different. Do we have an agreement on carbon costs? So I love the nice charts here, but the truth is that we don't put a cost to a kilo of carbon. We don't have a carbon tax. I myself, I work possibly too long time on the ETS. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. So I'm looking forward to Claude's speech to listen to how he wants to get rid of ETS and what he proposes. But definitely what we need is a fair price on carbon. And more you will see oil producers who say so. I mean, we had one wonderful event with a 96% renewable energy producer in Austria, Verbund AG, utility, together with OMV, which is a refinery and oil and they said, listen, hydrogen, fine, but I can't pay for it unless you put the price on carbon that it deserves. The oil producer says so. Now, this starts now. It's not the only one. Shell says it as well. This starts now. I don't see politicians listening to it. They should listen. They should invite these Shell people, these OMV people, listen to them, and then discuss how to put the right and the real price. And that's important. I see some cowardness everywhere. So if we want to go Paris, we need to get off this cowardness.
Gonzalo, I think you also had a point for the bad guy in the room.
For the cost. For the cost.
Poor thing.
I mean, I think the cost is the cost of generation.
Okay.
Okay, so renewables, photovoltaic gives you a cost of generation, and what we have to differentiate is the services provided by each technology. So if you have modern generation, you can provide flexibility, there will be a market for flexibility. If you have firmness, you will get, and there is a need for firmness, you will get another value for firmness. But the cost is the cost of generation. But I think in this new scenario, where flexibility, for instance, is a basic element, there will be market for flexibility. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And who can provide flexibility? Nuclear can provide flexibility, perfect. You get an extra value for your flexibility.
Yeah. Again, just to clarify, when I say apples for apples, I'm talking about the net power supplied to a consumer. So if that wind turbine plant only works 33% of the time, then the consumer needs electricity 100% of the time. There's going to be a need for the gap to be filled. And the cost of generation for that gap is not included in the net cost of the wind turbine versus the nuclear plant that works at 90% of the time and doesn't need that backup power. So that's the difference, and we call it systems cost. So that's what that's what I was referring to, just to clarify the differences.
So I'd also like to ask, though, if we were to imagine that, for example, the newest nuclear in the EU is Hinkley Point in the UK, which is subsidised and will be ultimately paid for by the UK taxpayer. Can we really imagine that it will be able to pay back the cost of its construction if we are imagining a load-following nuclear power plant which only has operating hours or capacity factor of 10, 20% a year? Should we reach that very high renewables penetration scenario, Can we imagine that Westinghouse would be building new nuclear with such a small capacity factor?
No. No. I mean, so if the suggestion is, or the assumption is that we get to 90% renewables across the EU, regardless of territorial differences in their environment. So if you go, I spent 3 years in Sweden, and I wish them the best if they think they can do solar to get to 90%, but and go through the winters there. Or our friends in Central and Eastern Europe who absolutely say that the renewables directive, which they are, of course, bound to uphold, they don't want to do anything more because they find it more costly, and therefore they want to go for more nuclear. Now, whether it's competitive or not, that's up to us. If we cannot provide a competitive product, then we shouldn't be in business. That's no doubt. So the question about Hinkley Point and others, they have to be able to compete in the UK process, which we fully agree, because the UK process at least was technology agnostic. I mean, it was bring low carbon technology, best bids possible in a diverse portfolio. And they did that.
But was it really? Because I think for that amount of money, for like such a long-term contract for that amount, you could have had a lot of renewables and a lot of efficiency. I don't think that competition actually took place. So it's not really agnostic.
Well, again, again, we have to, the apples to apples scenario. So when we say a lot of money, it is a lot of money. But as I mentioned earlier, that's the total cost of the plant for its lifetime that is licensed for 60 years. I'm not going to defend Hinkley Point. That's not our project. We're in the UK too, and we're negotiating with the UK government, and don't be surprised if the price comes down a little lower than Hinkley Point. The point, and because this is not a commodity, by the way. I mean, just like wind turbines are not commodities or PVs. So we are actually in a situation where we have to improve. We know that. However, if we look at where we're doing serial construction, like in China, where the French have been building there, we have been building there, lots of other people, the prices are going down, just like you see in renewables. It just doesn't come out in the space here because we're not doing it here. And in fact, we are not able to get that serial build here and get the economics until we get going. And so, yes, either we take advantage of this technology or we let it die in Europe. That's quite possible. But the cost then on climate and energy price and security, I think, is one of the things that we have to talk about. That's a
positive example of the UK, because it seems UK goes for nuclear only. Now, there is a very positive example of UK, which builds up, of course, renewable and wind. That's Leeds. Leeds City Project, Leeds 21. Maybe you've heard about that. So Leeds has the capacity with their pipelines, because they had town gas before, to use them for hydrogen. So they will have, in 2021, and it pays off, no extra cost. The social cost, of course, we need to change your burners to fuel cells, but the grid will be full of hydrogen, no combustion, just chemical processes and no emission. And that is very interesting. So the UK is fascinating in the facet of what they are going to go, and it's interesting. Yeah.
So the Leeds project, for some context, is one of the types of ways that you can produce hydrogen would be steam methane reforming, coupled with a CCS project as well.
Yes.
I think it's useful, maybe because there's some of you curious in the room about the ways that you can produce hydrogen. And we've been perhaps harsh on Michael about the costs of nuclear. So maybe we can be harsh on Jorgo about the costs of hydrogen at the moment, because there's either the renewables electrolysis route or there's steam methane reforming. If you want it to be green, you need carbon capture and storage. At the moment, I understand these are only pilot projects. So what do you think we would need to bring the costs down for hydrogen to get off the ground beyond the pilot stage?
Yeah. I will mention a project which many people might not like, but I think we agree that for some years we might have refineries, right? And in refineries, you need, as a chemical substance to clean up the crude oil, you need hydrogen. At the moment, the hydrogen which is used in refineries is gray. So I tell you the truth, 1 ton of hydrogen, 10 tons of CO2. And it's produced on the refinery from natural gas. If we replace that gray hydrogen by green hydrogen that stems from renewable and electrolysis, you reduce the emission, the upstream, by 10. That's like this. So if the Commission says it's possible, your refinery can use green hydrogen instead of biofuel to mitigate climate effects, then we don't need subsidies. We have a business case tomorrow. Give you one example. We start this now in the port of Rotterdam with BP and Uniper and Maasvlakte. The port of Rotterdam has 5 refineries. It's 20% of the CO2 emissions of the Netherlands. 20% of one country there. So if you replace the production, you have a climate effect, which is wonderful. No subsidy, so business case. But there are transitions, as you can see, and there might be the need to ramp up the volume of hydrogen via the CCS methodology, which is used, by the way, in the UK and also in Norway. So there's one big European producer, Statoil, that now starts to do the CCS and the steam methane reforming offshore, so far away from the continent. They are doing that. Why they are doing that? Not because they are good people and want to produce hydrogen, maybe they are, but they need this captured carbon to put it back to the well in order to have more pressure to get out the methane. So it's economical reasons. But the result is blue hydrogen, so hydrogen without CO2, which in big volumes and much cheaper can help to manage this transition process in the European hydrogen economy.
So early on, chemical or industrial processes you think will prove the technology to allow it to be deployed at a greater scale?
Absolutely. I mean, alone the refinery case would help in the next years to bring down the costs by 4 to 5 immediately. But we need the acknowledgement. So it's just a political decision. It's a delegated act, Remy. It's a delegated act. It's not a big deal. But the biofuel people don't like it because they lose markets. So that's the point. But basically, it's feasible in short time.
And I wanted to bring in another point that Manon made, which I thought might be a good question for you, Gonzalo. That in Spain, I didn't see in your scenarios much space for the Spanish consumer or the prosumer. And currently there is a tax on putting solar on your rooftop in Spain. The theme of this week is clean energy for all Europeans, and I think we'll hear a little bit later about what that's meant to be. And so Manon said we should look to some of these new actors who might be in the landscape. And prosumers weren't part of your scenario.
Okay, I want to mention prosumers and also coal, because I think there's another
Good
issue
idea.
that coal, the most polluting technology in Europe, and is still very important, remains a very important technology, something like a contradiction. On prosumers, we are considering that most of the, especially for photovoltaic, you have a distributed generation and centralized generation. We are considering both. We think that with photovoltaic, there are economies of scale. So in general, there will be more centralized generation. But we are also considering distributed generation. If you want to, if in a market context, it will be most centralized generation will be developed. But if you want decentralized generation, you will need some kind of regulatory arrangement or support for these facilities to be competitive. In the case of Spain, there was a big regulatory problem with the tariff structure. So the problem is a very Spanish issue, but pro-consumers, if they install their own facility, the problem is that with the tariff structure, the current tariff structure, that where the variable cost, the variable part of the tariff is very big in relation to the fixed part. If you don't pay this variable tariff, you don't pay part of the fixed cost of the system. And in this case, other consumers, the consumers that they don't have their own facility, they don't produce their energy, will have to pay for this fixed cost. So the government, what the government did, instead of changing the tariff structure, they say, because you don't pay, if I install my own distributed generation and I avoid the payment of fixed cost, I will have to pay for this fixed cost. So what I think is that in this new scenario where photovoltaic is so competitive, tariff structures should be adapted to this new situation. There is a very good report by the MIT that is called Utility of the Future. that address this problem and gives recommendation on how to give signals to consumer for an efficient development of centralized and decentralized generation. This is about decentralized generation. And about coal-fired generation, that is, we haven't talked here, but it's the most polluting form of producing electricity, and is Europe, we have like this very ambitious objective of reducing CO2 emissions, air quality, renewables. It's kind of a contradictory that coal remains a very important form of generation. And this is the case because it received, I would say, economic incentives. Why? Because you were saying the social cost of CO2 is really high. And coal facilities or emitting facilities, they are not paying for this cost. So I think this is a kind of subsidy. That's why I say it's very important a environmental fiscal reform where all energy consumers, and not just the consumers of the ETS, but also the consumers of the transport sector, pays for CO2 the same level, and not just for the CO2, but other pollutants that provoke, for instance, the problems of air quality in cities. And this is, I think, one of the key policies in order to advance, to move forward to a really decarbonized system in Europe. And I think it's one.
To make this clear, if you drive a battery car in Germany now, you have 60% of coal. So and this is something, sorry, 44. It's the other way around. But this happens, and we need to discuss this openly. And we shouldn't hide things away. So this is to be discussed, and this is to be reduced. I mean, in the end, we want all the same renewables, 100%. Maybe you have a slight difference, but
If you can do it, do it.
And to complement that, just if you drive an electric car, you pay for CO2 because the electricity sector is in the ETS, and you pay for renewables because today renewables till today weren't competitive, and you are paying for these subsidies. And if you go in a gasoline or diesel car that is much more polluting, you don't pay for CO2 because the transport sector is not in the ETS, and you don't pay for renewables because renewables are introduced into the electricity sector. And I don't know if this is the right economic signal to promote the cleanest technologies.
exactly.
Can I just make a tiny point?
I think this will have to be our last comment because we're running
Yeah,
out
no,
of
just
time.
on
Thank you.
the first point on like renewables not bearing that cost. I mean, I think there's a lot of consumers out there, or communities or cities that would be very happy to pay the cost of connection and do it. It's just I think a lot of the regulatory systems are actually blocking small-scale renewables or like different types of investments and large utilities. And I think especially if we're talking about the electrified future, I know we're talking about electrified and hydrogen future, but it's important that there's a lot of different types of actors.
Okay, well, thank you for everyone's attention and to my 4 participants today. I thought it was really constructive and we managed to argue with one another, but in a friendly way, which is always good to see. So thank you, all of you.
Okay.
First panel.